remembering our late colleague Charlie Kirk and honoring his mission. Now, that mission, of course, includes spreading the Turning Point USA message to more and more schools and campuses all across the country. Before we get into some of the very, very violent pushback against that, joining us now to talk about the hurdles in front of that, or why that's important also, and why that's important, is Aaron Boxer. He's the CEO of Diversified Education Services. And Aaron, I have to ask you a question. As someone who's not only an educator, a lot of times when we bring in educators, even on this program, they're administrators. They work from the 30,000-foot level, and some of them are very important, and I'm not disparaging them in any way. But you actually work with real students one-on-one. And I wonder, what do you think of students getting involved in organizations like this above and beyond their education in just a regular classroom? This is something that in many cases really augments their education, doesn't it?
Yes. Jake, it's great to be on, and I appreciate you mentioning that. These campus protests and the violence that we're seeing right now, that the consequences of an education system, it's abandoning critical thinking and going more towards emotional indoctrination. So for years, these universities have taught students what to think instead of how to think. We replaced debate with censorship, truth with ideology, and resilience with this outrage. So now when young adults encounter a viewpoint they don't like, they don't argue, they riot. So it's not just about politics, it's about the collapse of intellectual maturity.
This is an interesting point that I think started many, many years ago, especially with climate change. I mean, there were literally lesson plans that were telling young people that unless we do X, Y, and Z, unless your parents stop driving SUVs in 50 years or in 40 years or maybe 20 years, life on this planet is going to be greatly reduced. There's going to be a massive crisis. There'll be wildfires every other week. I mean, we really injected a level of anxiety. The indoctrination that you're talking about doesn't come along with peace of mind. It comes along with just the opposite. You work with young people. If there's one thing that's, I think, spreading among all young people from all walks of life, religious, not religious, right, left, there is an anxiety epidemic in this country for people under 30. And I think that this indoctrination menu that they've been receiving their whole lives has a lot to do with it. I really do.
Yes, if you watch some of the videos, you'll see some of these younger people in tears, hysterical, afraid that the world is going to end in 10 years. They did the same thing when I was a kid. I was under the impression when I was in high school, and this is back in the late 80s, early 90s, that Florida was going to be underwater by the turn of the 21st century. Education and colleges are supposed to be incubators for ideas, not echo chambers for activism. So we've raised a generation that's confused about their feelings, confusing feelings with facts, because educators stopped demanding rigor and they started prioritizing this ideology. And when that happens, you don't get dialogue, you get chaos and anxiety, as you mentioned. If we want to restore sanity, we need to rebuild education around logic and discourse, accountability, and get out of this disgusting victimhood and the mob mentality. That starts long before college. It starts with parents, teachers, and schools that teach kids, again, how to think, not what to believe.
You know, Aaron, I got to ask you about this because I'm with you. I'm with you on the critical thinking and all that kind of stuff. I think it's important. But there's another part of this that even when that is in place, people sometimes forget. There was an amazing piece written about, I want to say 15 years ago, by a recent Harvard graduate who in his year after Harvard went back to his fancy prep school, St. Paul's up in New England, as a teaching fellow, which is a great program, by the way. A lot of these fancy prep schools do this. And he was shocked because the students were really well trained in critical thinking, but they also didn't know what side France was in World War II. They didn't have their basic history facts. And so there's got to be a little bit of both. I mean, that could also help reduce some of the anxiety if, while we're trying to teach them critical thinking, we're also teaching them some facts. I mean, I can't wait to go up against some of the young teens on Jeopardy next year. I'm just kidding. But they don't seem to know some of the basic facts of history because they're too busy getting indoctrinated all the time.
Absolutely. They also preach about free speech, but they try and suppress it as well. So they're not prioritizing what the standards of what kids are going to need when they wind up leaving school. And school is not just about the content. It's not just about math, reading, and writing. It's about learning how to learn. And then trying to teach kids also about free speech. You should see some of the things they're teaching in these civics classes where they're only giving one side of the argument. How do you develop free speech if you don't see what the other side is saying? So when they wind up hearing something that is different from what they've learned growing up, then they become more fearful of it. So free speech now means approved speech. You can say almost anything as long as it aligns with the dominant ideology. And the moment a conservative voice speaks up, living here in a blue state, it's labeled as dangerous or hateful. And then if we go to colleges where they should be the marketplace of ideas, they're not the monopolies of some type of ideology. So we've kind of lost the messaging. Like, what is the priority for kids? Are we preparing them for life later on, or are we trying to mold them into an ideology where the person at the front of the classroom who's teaching the content is the dominant one?
Yeah, I mean, we just showed the scene of the Charlie Kirk assassination. I mean, his killer was indoctrinated by someone or something to believe that Charlie Kirk was hateful. People are still saying that now. And I asked them, okay, show me the video where he says something racist. Show me the video where he said, I mean, they can't do it because they've just been told this. And, you know, you talk about the critical thinking skill. There's another skill, and I talked about this a lot when I'm working and running television programs over the last decades and things like that. I said the greatest skill you can have, not only as a debater, but as someone who's trying to bring forth ideas, is can you fairly summarize the opposing view to yourself, what the other side says? Even though you don't agree with it, can you fairly summarize it without demonizing it, without twisting it? Can you just say, hey, these guys are for this? You know, I've been shocked, by the way, how many times I haven't had to twist, for example, some of the left-wing positions. I mean, they really don't want any ICE enforcement, for example. They don't want any illegal aliens deported. I'm not twisting. I mean, how else can you explain J.B. Pritzker telling his cops, hey, you might have to go arrest ICE agents, things like that. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the backlash. We've talked about the innocent victimization of the otherwise innocent kids in these schools. But then, of course, you have the people who are no longer innocent once they start doing things like we saw at Kennesaw State, this ugly reaction to Turning Point USA. We also had something at Illinois State where a slightly older person, a teaching assistant, an assistant professor, flipped over a table. But at Kennesaw State, it was much more violent. So how does this become an acting out? You said that these people end up rioting. How does that happen? Is it the anxiety, or is someone actually telling them, go beat these people up?
I'd really like to know if there's some funding that's been driving this, because after Charlie Kirk was assassinated, you would think that maybe people want to temper things down, but that's not what's happening. And by the way, there are people on these sites on where the kids are playing their games with, they're getting in. There's this woke mind virus that Elon Musk talks about. They're getting to the kids very young. It's not just in the classrooms. It's where kids congregate. You have this messaging that seems to be everywhere, and it definitely steers more towards the left. So the reaction at Kennesaw State, it was symbolic, as you pointed out. It wasn't just about a man; it was about a message. And Charlie Kirk, he stood for free markets, accountability, patriotism, Jesus Christ, values that don't fit a narrative across this country, especially in these left-wing institutions. So when they deface his memorial, it's not about rebellion. It's about a resentment towards someone who reminded them what freedom actually looks like. And those protesters, they don't want freedom. They want suppression. They only want their voices heard.
Aaron, the teachers' unions have long been a problem with all of this, and it just keeps getting uglier. Randi Weingarten is someone who, again, she was at the No Kings rally over the weekend calling Trump voters fascists. Someone who's in charge of teachers in this country, or at least has a huge amount of influence on teachers in this country, telling half the country, and more than half of the voting country in this last election, that they're fascists, that should be completely disqualifying. I mean, this should not be someone who's involved with the teacher. She wants to get involved in a militant political movement, go for it. That's fine. She has every right to do that. But it's not supposed to be partisan in a teachers union. And, I want to recommend a book to everyone, by the way, and to you as well if you haven't read it. A fantastic book that has an important chapter in it. The book is called The Ungovernable City. It's by Vin Canato. And it has a chapter explaining how the modern teachers union was born in the mid-'60s to early '70s. It went from a professional organization that just talked about education to a militant political organization because in those years in New York specifically, teachers were actually getting physically attacked by students and their parents. So you can understand where they're coming from. But that's why they're so violently against parents and children, because the teachers unions, as we know them today, were born out of a time when they were being physically attacked. That's not happening anymore, by the way. So it's amazing to me that people don't get this. But I mean, when your students come to you, to your program, I mean, do you start telling them about how half the country is a bunch of fascists? I mean, it's
kids about politics unless they have an assignment that has to do with it. I feel like that's something that should happen at home with adults leading by example. But I just want to make one or back up your point about the liberal infection that started back in the 1960s. It was during the free speech movement. You had these 60s radicals. They are the professors of today. A lot of them are probably retiring, but their thought leadership was what led us down this very dark path. So you combine this with Donald Trump's populist approach conflated with now Trump derangement syndrome. His thoughts and followers represent this existential threat to the power brokers that have led our country from behind the scenes. And the radical leftist ideologies that are propagated by the unions, by the college institutions, we got here because the adults in charge, they stopped drawing lines. These professors, politicians, administrators have excused this behavior for years under the banner of expression. So you can't teach self-control if you reward chaos. And we told people, the young people, that feelings outweigh facts. And now we're shocked when they're starting to burn down flags and knock down Charlie Kirk's memorials. It's an infection that has spread throughout everything.
Yeah, it's also called child abuse. Aaron Boxer, thanks so much for joining us. Thank you for your work directly with young people. And I'm glad that there's people like you in contact with our kids as opposed to militants. Thank